Greetings, my lords and ladies. For today, we are traveling back in time into an ancient mythical world. I'm talking, of course, about the Texas Renaissance Festival, as we discuss the new HBO documentary limited series, Ren Faire.
Okay, here we go.
Good morrow and well met. It's a beautiful morning here in Newmarket Village. My goodness, is it time for the festival to begin already?
I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser, and this is episode number 199 of Dolby Creator Talks. Joining us today is documentary filmmaker Lance Oppenheim, as well as sound supervisor and re-recording mixer Paul Hsu. We're happy to have Lance joining us for the first time on the podcast, and this is our third conversation with Paul, having previously discussed his work on Genius the Kanye West Story, as well as Tick Tick Boom. This conversation was recorded in person in front of a live audience just a couple of weeks ago at Dolby's screening room in Midtown Manhattan, as part of our ongoing collaboration with the Artist Academy and Film at Lincoln Center. We discussed the Ren Faire's appropriately over-the-top theatrical style, as well as its incredible sonic world building. And in true Lance Oppenheim style, he very cleverly mixes real and fantastical elements. And often the line between those two is pretty gray. So that's exactly where I wanted to start today's conversation, by asking Lance how the real world of the Texas Renaissance Festival lent itself to his signature style and its blend of documentary versus narrative storytelling techniques.
I think this was the first time I ever stepped a foot in a place where every single person that works there is an actor, really. That's what they do. That's what their trade is. They're reenactors at a reenactment theme park. And so I knew that whatever we were doing formally would have to match their version of reality. That the moment you put a camera down somewhere and you're attempting to hide or camouflage yourself as a fly on the wall, it wouldn't work because no matter what, people will always be aware and reactive to the camera. So I wanted to kind of embrace the theatricality that they live their lives by. The thing that jumped out to me, the potential and opportunity with the film, was this is a real life fiefdom. This is an imitation. It's not just an imitation of the Renaissance period. I mean, I was just fascinated by the way power was manifesting in a place like this, even as a place as non-traditional as a Renaissance fair, this really intense sort of the power structures and strictures of how things used to be were on display there. So I knew that we'd have to find a way to do the same thing, not just imitate the period, not just imitate the world that everyone lived in, but really embrace it, inhabit it, break through it, use as many tools in my cinematic arsenal to crack through the looking glass and hopefully document interesting performances and find something very real and emotional and vulnerable on the other side of it.
Tell me about bringing Paul onto the project, and what were your first conversations, and sort of how did you guys approach what is I think a very impressionistic sound design?
Well, Paul is brilliant. For one, I mean, I was just sort of like, in my dreams, I could work with someone like this. Been a huge fan of Paul's work for a long time. He worked on a series with my editor, Max Allman, named Genius, the Kanye documentary series, which I loved. He also worked on Foxcatcher. He also worked on Beau is Afraid. He worked on so many different movies that the sound design and the texture and the world, the mix was all just part and parcel with the film. For this, I was like, we need to do something where we immerse the audience in the landscape, in the immersive stage that is the Renaissance fair world. And we also need to find ways to carry over the magic, the Ren Faire magic, into the corporate drama, because that's how everyone sort of saw it themselves. I mean, the weird thing, yeah, you should.
I was going to say, I think it's really, these things sound is a really hard thing to talk about in a way. It's like, it's very abstract. So, Lance and I met it was like 18 months ago, right? It wasn't even that long ago. And within, the first 90 seconds, it was really clear, like, oh, we're clearly coming from the same aesthetic place. And then from there, you just kind of play and have fun if you're starting from that similar origin. And in a weird way, sound design is such an abstract thing. It's really hard to talk about or really understand. And in a way, like the thing that I'm always going for is, I was thinking about it on the way up, it's almost it's very parallel to the unique style that Lance does as a filmmaker, where it's my favorite thing is to do something which seems real but is actually highly manipulative. And I think that's, people are trying to figure that out about your style too. It's like, it's verite sort of, but not at all. Like it's like weirdly fantastical, but feels very grounded, like in the verite style. And for the sound design in general, I'm always going for that. And definitely for these projects, it's like we're trying to sort of almost play a trick on the audience all the time to make them feel like what you're seeing is very real. But at the same time, why is it so like sparkly and doing all these things? And that's the trick.
Look, there's a long lineage and tradition of documentary cinema and that's more or less what I'm trying to hew as close to. I've always been obsessed with Abbas Kiarostami's movies and Close Up, which is very formally different than this. But the idea with that film was embracing reenactments, embracing performance as a form of truth. And to me, with this project, it's like everything you're seeing on the screen is real. But I wanted to also acknowledge too that the moment you drop a camera anywhere, you violate the reality. So it's absurd. All of it's absurd. Documentary filmmaking is absurd. Nonfiction storytelling is absurd. So like, if we can acknowledge that, can we push past it and find something new? And that's something, I mean, Paul is just a brilliant artist. And when we first met, I was like, let's just hang out all the time. I want to pick your brain. So we go to the Turkish Russian baths all the time and steam it out, come up with ideas.
Exactly. And if you're in the studio listening to the conversations, you'd think we're crazy, because it's a constant back and forth of like, is this too far or not? And hopefully we arrive at some balance that feels legitimate. But it's like, if you overheard the conversation as we're mixing, you think we were both crazy. We're like, okay, this is too far. That isn't.
I really appreciate what you were saying too about kind of this embracing the artifice and leaning into it. Because I feel like what you're doing with this film in particular is you're really embracing the techniques of cinema to give the audience the subjective experience that some of these characters are having, and thereby getting to a deeper emotional truth of what they're experiencing. And I'm thinking about that remarkable sequence at the end of episode 1 with Jeff at the fair in Germany when he gets the call that, that Louis is going to buy the festival.
Y'all, it's King Louis now. Oh, we always knew it was him. We knew it was him. We knew it was him. Jeff!
One more drink will bring me closer to you.
All hail the new commander, Louis.
The key to a successful business is to take risks.
No. I have a plan to sell it all.
And that sequence just goes, I mean, it's kind of an apeshit sequence in terms of like the way you guys are manipulating the sound. And what you're doing is you're really giving me the experience of what Jeff was experiencing in that moment. So talk about, putting that sequence together, the idea, when that idea came to you, how you went about crafting that. I'm in love with that sequence.
I always make a point of pointing out that, in any movie that you see, maybe there's a few exceptions, but in general, the sound design starts in the Avid. It starts with the picture editor, right? So it's like, it's not like I show up and wave some magic wand over the cut, and now it's those choices, the rhythms, the textures, all that stuff that starts in the Avid with the picture editor. And Max absolutely laid all that groundwork, and then when we're mixing, we just have to hopefully bring it to another level. But it's like, that's where the pillars of what's going to happen, that's where it goes down.
The idea of the sequence came in the moment, really, for the most part. Most of the things in this, the way I like to work is I start with interviewing somebody, and that may never make it into the film, or maybe the audio will, but I do it so I can understand emotionally where they are. and also just literally what is going on in their lives. What's this? Is there an event that's about to happen? In the case of Germany, we had known Jeff was already anxious about leaving, and we also knew that he was feeling anxious through another interview about his job and everything else. So all these, sounds, choices, aesthetic things, we're riffing off of the reality that actually exists that's there. Even the dragon at the end of the second episode, the things that the dragon is saying to Jeff are things that Jeff and other people around Jeff had said, Jeff said about himself, about his fear, how he needed to talk to George, or his Brandy, his wife. A lot of those lines even came from her in a previous scene. The person who does the dragon's voice is Jeff Baldwin's brother, who does he does a lot of the voices in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He's a voice actor. And so like the degree to which this is like a very collaborative thing, we're starting with reality and then we find ways to express it in cinema and use all of the tools of cinema, hopefully, to get me there. And it's a lot easier to do when you're working with the people like Paul, who, has just made absolutely incredible films, and the artistry he brings to this. He's being a little humble because, of course, we're trying things in the edit, but those things become, it feels like this absolutely magical thing happens when Paul puts his hands on it.
But that's, to me, that's actually the job, is to bring, it's more of an emotional, you're trying to create some sort of emotion through the use of sound, right? And so my first job is to basically surprise him somehow.
Jeffrey, you're running out of time.
Makes big choices.
It's now or never. You must speak to the king.
Because he knows the movie inside out. He knows it almost from memory. He can say every line from memory. He knows every cut, when it's coming, when the next cut's coming. So the job is to somehow,
Well, and I love, Paul, you found some great opportunities. Even with sequences that weren't necessarily that super flashy, Jeff's staff meeting at the top of episode 2, when he's just trying all these ideas and nobody's responding to it in the room. And then you have a great moment of subjective sound design at the end of that staff meeting that is just fantastic. I think I love that exploration.
27,792 tickets sold. Net income is
We got all of the credit card machines
975,000
for parking and for camping set up.
I will give you a list of the receipts that I do not have.
If you have hired somebody, I need to know who they are. I need to know that so that I can pay them.
Understand?
Yeah. See, some people got paid on Thursday.
For me, it always
the
feels
bank.
Fridays.
And I'm trying to also get geofenced in so that they can move on.
The technique, from what, probably 50 years ago, is you add reverb to the voice and they feel like they're in an echo chamber of some sort. And so we're always trying to find like, what's the novel way to do that, and it's usually just a sleight of hand thing, basically, where you're trying to like create this feeling that the audience hopefully is not quite understanding what is happening, and that's the goal, to give them just throw them off kilter a little bit, so that they don't think about what they're hearing, but you create some sort of emotional response.
And you put, I think, the thing in that scene too that you did surprise me with, I remember, is you could barely hear it in the production audio. I don't even think it really was there, but there's someone chewing gum. It's like
That's
sound.
what that was, because I heard that clicking. I was like,
it clicked. So Paul took that sound of someone chewing gum, and then he kind of turned it into like a ticking clock.
The term sleight of hand is almost literal. Like, that's what I'm always looking for, is these sort of circular ideas where you see something or you hear something and you realize, oh, that could be this other thing. And then luckily you have the advantage of being able to play it over and over again. The audience doesn't have that advantage. So if you sort of lay the groundwork for this sleight of hand thing, which hopefully will plant some idea in their mind, and then you reveal it or don't reveal it, or that's half the battle.
One of the things I love about what you're talking about is you're just talking about pure creativity and art. This is not technologically driven. There's nothing that you're describing that a student working on a short film in college couldn't do. They just have to have the time to experiment and the creativity to think about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if the comparison is, like taking great photographs, right? And in its purest form, it's kind of simple. You have something you want to shoot, but how do you frame it? It's like, and for mixing and sound design, I always make the sort of joke of we only do 3 or 4 things. You make it louder, you make it quieter. EQing is the same thing. You make the bass louder, you make the bass quieter.
Put some reverb on it.
Yeah, exactly. You cut, you fade, you don't cut, you don't. It's like you only have about 8 choices, and it's how you put them together is the whole point.
You guys had just done Sperm World together. If you guys haven't seen this is another remarkable documentary that Lance made earlier in the year that's streaming on Hulu. How would you describe this? It's an exploration of the dark underground world of sperm donors.
Very tame by comparison, despite the title, right? After that.
Yeah, it's about people who meet on Facebook forums for free sperm. So women who have tried to get pregnant and have been unsuccessful through the traditional methods, going to a sperm bank and can't afford it anymore. And then you have men whose motivations are more obscure, that are looking to donate their sperm for free, and it becomes a compulsion for them. They're a compulsion to help, but a compulsion to like masturbate in bathrooms for other people. Anyway, very different film and very different approach to sound. On that film, we were trying to do something that was there was a lot of different moments that I remember you would do something similar, like that gum thing. On Sperm World, there's a moment with one of our participants, Rachel. She's in a pool, and this sort of ambience starts creeping in, and it's unclear where it's coming from, and it blends into the next scene, which is this sort of echoey shuffling sound of a bunch of men inside a synagogue. So it's like that movie was all about this exercise, I feel like, really for me in subtlety, and then finding and seeing what Paul could do, just the magical touches to hums, electrical hums. And
in Ren Faire, there's so much going on that you don't get that feeling. But yes, Sperm World is more sort of a study in minimalist approaches a lot of the time, where it's like, never underestimate the effect of the choices of the backgrounds and the room tones that you make. And if you can push them 15% one direction or the other, again, you can create an emotional response that the audience is not aware of, hopefully, but you're pushing the story along.
I mean, in that one, I felt it was almost like, remember we were talking a little bit about or at least I was thinking about it, the Ray Bradbury short story about I think it's in the Martian Chronicles, about like a house that's been deserted, and the only thing that's left is just all these electrical appliances making noises. And for some reason, at least that was what stuck with me when we were making that movie. It's ultimately, there's a dimension to it. It's about technology and kind of modern loneliness. And so there's so many electrical things that are almost as loud as like human touch. But with this, it was the opposite. I feel like we did everything that Paul was like, I don't like when we first met, he's like, I don't like things that are that loud or busy. And this, I was like, we got to make it fucking loud and fucking busy. We got to go crazy. We got to bring people inside the universe of the fair. And so the question was how to do it, hopefully artfully, while being absurd too.
Exactly. Well, I like it loud, just not too loud. That's
I feel like you guys had some good absurd fun. I heard a Wilhelm in there in the first.
We had to get that Wilhelm.
Well, that was my only objection. I tried to keep it out, but
I was insistent on the Wilhelm scream. I needed that thing. Well, because to me there was something funny to me about immediately the documentary announces itself. Yes. It's to me, like Max and Nick, my editors, Nick Nasby, Max Hallman, they came up with the term docu-fantasia, and I think that's pretty apt for what this is. You're watching something that is real, but the methods of expressing the reality are so heightened. And the question for audiences is, can you stomach that? Can you see this thing that ultimately is true and emotional and real, but can you also stomach manipulation of a Wilhelm scream that may actually be there for the people who exist there, right? Like there's this magic of the fair, and people fucking absolutely adore movies. They adore Star Wars. I'm trying to take all of these things and kind of stylistically make homages to the things that people care about there.
To your point, when I heard that, immediately in the first 2 minutes, I was like, okay, I think I understand where this is going. Like this is really going to be pulling out a bunch of really interesting techniques to tell this story. So I took it for what it's worth. I thought it was a great choice. I want to ask you a little bit about and acknowledge Jack Sobo, who was the production sound mixer for you, and also stayed on and contributed sound design. So can you talk a little bit about that collaboration and about how the tracks that Jack recorded on location then kind of evolved into the sound design for the film?
Even on the biggest budget movies, the effort to collaborate between the post sound people and the production sound people is really difficult, to be honest. It's very there for whatever reason, it's very delineated.
There's a firewall kind of.
Yeah, and it's usually if I've worked with, like, if there's a location mixer that a director loves and I know is going to be on their next movie, and I also have a relationship with the director, that's usually when it actually happens. But it takes that level of sort of pre-made connection for it to actually happen, and then the conversation starts and there can be a real back and forth, which is great, right? Unfortunately, that's not usually the case. In this case, because Jack was already recording the production sound, the idea was already, it was built in, basically, because he also works in post. It was a rare example where he could be the person. And what's great about that is the biggest thing is that in post you spend a lot of time having to get to the place where you understand the thing that the director heard when they were there, right? So there's a lot of, but it didn't sound like that, or but when we were there, it was because you weren't there. So Jack was there. So that the shortcut there was just invaluable. So Lance didn't have to have those conversations with Jack because he was literally there recording the sound. So he knew all the language of this is a very specific environment, right? And he was there and had been on set with them and knew all those environments, by having been there. So that was the great thing.
He had an archive of just field recordings that he would inventory. And Jack is brilliant. I mean, Jack Sobo. He does production sound. He does a lot of post sound. He did all of the sound design on Sasquatch Sunset. If anyone saw that film, the Zellner brothers movie, he was there doing kind of what he did here. He was recording sound, and then he did like the baby Sasquatch sound in that movie is his voice. He's a very creative person. And what he would also do on this project was before we would get to Paul, he would almost take our cuts, like our fine cuts, and he would start designing based on what was there already. So when Paul would, get everything, it wouldn't be this, kind of let's start from ground, square one, where it's just like, let's just figure it out. Our timeline was so compressed in the scheme of things. I remember Paul was like, if really the normal timeline for this is probably like 4 times as long as what you actually have here. But we were able to make accomplish so much ground because of the work that Jack had laid down before us. And then Paul doing his thing, or for sequences that Jack couldn't hit, Paul kind of starting from, wherever we were.
That part of the creative process is it ranges widely. So there's always, on almost every project, I can remember that there's always 2 moments that I remember, which is the one sound that was done very early on with no preconceived idea, no conversation at all, and then stayed there the entire time and is in the final mix. And then the opposite of that is there's always one thing which nobody could get right for months and months and months, maybe years. And then in the literal last hour of the mix, the director and I come up, find something that we agree is good, and we print it, and that's it. And it's been allegedly incubating all that time, but actually gets 90 seconds of real time at the end, and it's in the mix forever. And so that there's always that interplay. It's always an endless game of like finding those things, and the way you find them is very, very wide ranging.
So what are those 2 things in Ren Faire?
That's a good question.
Yeah, good question.
I'm thinking. I think there was a lot. We kept going back to the Enya sequence a lot in the second episode because of some complications legally. Something strange happened while we were working on this, where we, legally we could fair use 10 seconds of this Enya track, and I tried to get to her as much as I possibly could. I found her information online. I sent her an email, but she's Enya. She's a magical, mysterious person,
elusive creature.
Yes. So I never heard back, and I was like, well, fuck, and I was like, how is this even possible? That George literally listens to this song every single day. I went back and recorded just like a whole day's worth of, just to show the lawyers, like, look, 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. This is the only song that plays all the time. It's literally in our production audio, like in meetings when we're far away from it. So we had to do something where we took the first 10 seconds of her song, legally speaking, I was fine to use. And then Ari Beluzian, my composer, and he worked with a vocalist named Juliana. And they basically created their own version of this Enya song. And in a weird way, it actually ended up becoming so much deeper with Paul also, doing his thing to it. Because to me, the song would like enter my dreams. There's a nightmarish dimension to this like angelic hymn that ends up just creeping into every facet of your life. And for the 3 years that we were there, 100 however many days we were shooting this, that song literally was always on. And for those people who work there, it was, I forget how many years he says, I think 7 years or something for that one guy specifically. The crazy thing I should note,
they must hate that song.
They hate it. Yeah, absolutely. George, when he saw the second and third episode, he said his favorite scene was when Jeff sings Shrek, which is in the third episode. So if you guys haven't seen it, you should check it out. And he's now added that song supposedly to his new playlist. Who I'd Be from Shrek the Musical is the new Enya at Stargate Manor Arboretum.
You mentioned Ari Baluzian, who did the score. Talk about your collaboration with him and your work integrating those tracks into the sound design, because there's a remarkable, I feel, back and forth interplay between the sound design and the score in this.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. And we live in a time of an endless mimicking in film score, which I personally have to bear the brunt of the pain of. And Ari is just a huge exception to that rule. He just brings really interesting tracks. It's just things that you wouldn't ever guess or think, but they work, right? And just incredible, production style. Like there's kind of two types of music cues: the ones that you put in and instantly seem great, and the ones that you fight with for weeks to try to make them work. And Ari's only ever the first, the former. The way that he writes too is it's dense when it should be dense and it's sparse when it should be sparse, and that's a big part of it. It leaves room. It's like he's realizing that there's a dance that has to go on, and he's not just taking up all the bandwidth all the time, because we both have to be in the in the mix together, literally.
Do you have access to his score or sketches of it when you're kind of doing sound editing, or how do you? Because the nightmare obviously is like you show up, everything shows up on the dub stage for the final mix, and there's this collision between the sound design and the score.
Well, in this case, I mean, these, Lance alluded to this, I mean, these kind of like a documentary and a documentary for HBO is the timeline is quite compressed, right? So most of my people really aren't on for that long. So most of it is just conversations that Lance and I are having early on, or I'm looking at cuts. And then at the end, it's kind of a crazy compressed, dash to the finish. On a project like this, there's no time for any of that. So it kind of has to show up in good shape. And Ari came to, he was most of the mix, right? He was there almost the entire time.
He was there for all of Sperm World and basically all of Ren Faire.
Yeah. So he would be in LA finishing the last track. He would get on the red eye, come to New York, come to the studio,
bring it hot off fresh out of the oven.
Exactly. And there are other amazing times in the third episode. There's a cue that he had like two versions of that Paul would take and then blend into one. And then Paul would do some he'd mix in the water crisis in the second episode. And we just kept taking this like big drum, this big bass drum, and just putting it underneath different things to thicken it all out. It was amazing. I remember when I first told Paul, I was like, is it cool if Ari comes? And he didn't know Ari yet. He's just like, you motherfucker. You bring in the composer. The guy's going to make it all loud. He's going to make it louder than everything else. And then when they finally met each other,
we got along great.
Yeah, I mean, we all were so on the same frequency that it was I don't know, it was kind of automatic.
It's just a lie that some idiot posted on social media.
That's unbelievable. How could this be even happening right now? We had a brand new system, not even a possibility.
there's definitely an analogy of sort of, it's a bit like playing in a band together. So like until you sort of establish the mutual respect and trust and understand it's all going to be fine, but there, and what Lance is alluding to is there is, to be clear, a long history of composers coming to mixes and it's an inherent
just
conflict.
Complaining that their music's been turned.
It's an inherent conflict of interest. Like you show up as the composer, and of course, usually you want to hear your music louder.
Just going back to the nightmare at the end of the first episode, we spent a lot of time playing with the voices, the Jeff, that, there's a really quiet one at first. And I remember in the edit, it was always, both were extremely loud. And that was another thing you had done where you were like, it needs to be something that just, you hear it, but you're like, wait, what did that just happen? And then it happens again. You're like, this is insane. This is so ridiculous.
Young filmmakers here, and certainly in our audience online, Lance, I'd love for you to talk about your process of collaboration with Paul, with Ari, specifically on sound and music, and how you talk to them and how you sort of like advice for directors about how to work with sound and music.
I just feel so fortunate to work with all these amazing people. At the end of the day, I mean, it's like going to Paul. I remember I had tried to work with Paul in my first film. It didn't work out, but it's like there's a dimension. You just got to watch a lot of movies and understand why you like something and really refine your taste. And so when it comes time to actually, like when we met each other, I don't even remember what we were talking about, but it was so clear so quickly that we both just liked the same things. And to me, then the next thing that happens is if you understand and respect someone's taste and you respect their work, let them work, let them bring things to you that are going to be exciting. Tell them sort of how you maybe would think of things, but allow them the freedom to, be the artists that they are, the reason that you love their work. Let them do their magic to it.
There's some specific advice there actually, which is, I think you both, as the director, don't ever be shy to say that you don't like something, first of all, right? Because there's a lot of sort of, people like to sort of explain the reasons, well, it's because of this, or I did this because it doesn't matter. Like if he doesn't like it, it happens all the time. There's so many examples where I will literally spend, certainly on features, I'll spend an entire day mixing one scene, like a 2-minute scene, right? Because it's crucial, and then I'll play it for the director, and if they react poorly, that's the last time anyone will ever hear that scene that way. It's gone forever. I'll never play it again. They'll never hear it again. It certainly won't make it into the mix, right? So that
it might make it into a different movie.
Well, yeah, maybe, probably not though. So that it's really important to, as if you're the director, to speak your mind about what you're perceiving, but at the same time, what Lance was saying, it's like you don't necessarily do anyone any service by sort of micromanaging and trying to get into, well, what if it was this or that? Hopefully, you're just reacting to the feeling you're having, but you should speak up, like say you do or don't like something.
Most of the people I work with, I feel like we end up hopefully all falling in love with the work itself, right? And then it becomes a thing where, like, when I'm with Paul, it feels like we're not working. It feels like we're playing. When you're playing and there's that attitude of just like, well, let's just keep exploring and be as curious as we were personally, like as I am when I'm like going into these actual places and meeting people and asking questions, then it's sort of like this, it feels like there's this endless revision to it. And I mean, yeah, there are times where maybe that can go too far. Like I remember we worked so late and Paul's he's just so generous with his time. And it really felt like to me, it was never sort of like, I hate what you're doing here. It's always just sort of like, well, what if it's maybe a little bit more like this? And then Paul will push on me and we'll both get to like a much more interesting place by the end of whatever it was that I was reacting to initially.
Yeah, exactly. And it really is like playing, but there's also, there's an intensity to it that I've noticed recently that I'm used to spending time in rooms with 2 or 3 or 4 very intelligent, deeply creative people. And all we basically do is argue all day. Like lovingly, it's a battle to see whose opinion will convince the others. And that's all we do, but it's fun.
I have one final question before we open up and we'll take some audience questions if you have one. And Lance, this is for you. This is just for my own edification. I'm fascinated by the character of King George. He's I would call him mercurial. People are in favor, people fall out of favor. Sometimes they come back in favor, sometimes they don't.
I want to do art, chase ladies. I want to find a companion and I want to do my art in my garden. That's it. companion art garden. And that's all I want to do. Companion art garden. I want to find a companion and I want to do my art in my garden. That's it.
George.
Yep. Yep.
He turns on people, and I'm just curious for you as an artist telling the story, were you concerned that at some point he might turn on you?
All the time. I mean, really all the time. That was the most stressful part of making this thing, was even from the very beginning when we met him, it was sort of like, how are we going to convince him that spending time with us is valuable to him, because he's someone who craves control. That's ultimately the moment he feels vulnerable or expresses any degree of internal thought. He is afraid and he runs. I mean, he does it with the date in this episode. He does it, for people who've seen the third episode, he does it with selling the festival. He gets close to it. And as the moment he becomes mortal again, or he has to deal with people in a way that maybe other people deal with others, he destroys them. With us, the thing that's so bizarre to me, and I have my theories, but he never did fully turn on us. I think a part of it is that he is a really lonely person. The only people or company he spends, it's either his dates or it's like books that he reads or his inanimate objects like mannequins and golden nonsense that he's decorating his house with. But for us, the strangeness in our dynamic was that he had a captive audience for almost 3 years. Anything he did, he would have us there enwrapped in whatever, he was saying, or when he's talking about Andy Warhol in the third episode and how he jerked off the American people and that he hates his art. I was like, tell me more. That's great. Keep it coming. But yeah, even now, I mean, I still talk to him, and it's hard. It's like such a weird relationship because I do care for him in a weird way. I feel exactly actually the same way that all of the people there feel about him, which is that he's a brilliant person who obviously created something much bigger than himself. But he's also entrapped by it and he's terrifying. And, yeah, I mean, I'm still unpacking it. I probably should get a therapist to figure it out,
All right, let's open up and take some audience questions.
My question was kind of getting more into like the genesis of how this all came together, both in production and in post, just because like it's like you just mentioned, talking about like gaining his trust, and I'm assuming the rest of the people that the rest of your subjects. So I was kind of wondering more of what the process of that was and how like really just how you first discovered this, what like led to making this.
The origins of the project, it started with two journalists, David Govey Herbert and Abigail Rowe, and Abby discovered George in the world of George. David's an amazing long form, like narrative nonfiction writer. And when she brought him the world, he essentially wrote this one-pager thing. He brought it to me and he was like, you want to do this? And my first reaction was like, yes, but is this real? Like, does this even exist? It seems like crazy. I'm like, also, well, the fact that there's George, this person who's like, like as Jeff calls him, he's a self-made king and he's created this like real life fiefdom. I was like, the idea of like a nonfiction project that's set in this space but it's not really about the fair. It's about the corporate drama of the fair. And then the challenge will be, how do you take the fair magic and bring it to the corporate drama? Like all of these things started happening. And when we got down there, almost, I think like a week after they first presented the idea to me, really the first like entry point was Jeff. That scene where he's talking about Daddy's dying, who's got the will? And, here's a picture, here's me as Shrek, and he's saying that. that was the first day I ever met Jeff. I actually went to his office, like knocking on his door, being like, "Hey, you're the guy in charge.
Do you mind if we shoot?"
Yeah, well, not even. I was actually like, "Is it cool if we just get your approval to because I want you to know, like, I want to make this film, and this is what I'm interested in: the past, the present, the future of the fair. What's going to happen once George is no longer in power?" And then he's like, "Yeah, great." And I was like, "Do you have any concerns?" He's like, "No, not really." And I was like, "Okay." And things happened very quickly. Like, we realized we had the same birthday. He checked out my work. I think he had seen at least the trailer of my first film, Some Kind of Heaven. And so we, like he says in the show, him and George, we can communicate as artists. That's more or less what happened with Jeff and I. And then when I met George has been reading, like, Jeff has printed out every single review of the show, even the ones that talk about George in a negative light. And in the New Yorker, which was George's favorite magazine, they just wrote up the show. And I think that may have been the thing that also gave Jeff the promotion. George is just so happy. He's ecstatic that people are talking about him. In a way, he's achieved this dream of being like bigger than life. And because I think George also sees himself as this luminary, like a Walt Disney, Howard Hughes type. And so he doesn't care that he's being controversial, or he doesn't care that people are saying negative things about him. He just cares that people know who he is. And so I think now that I've known him this long and that he liked the show, it was I think that's what the psychologically is happening. I think he just wanted to be seen. And that's really the same logic that I think applies to Jeff and to Darla and to Louis. For each of them, they wanted to be seen by the end. For Darla, it was, I want to be seen because I want protection. I want you to bear witness to what's happening to me, that I'm being essentially abused in the workplace. For Louis, it was sort of like, I want there to be an audience to see how hard I'm working to try and buy this place because I care about it. And for Jeff, it started with I love this guy and I love this place and I will do anything in my power for it. And by the end, it became a lot more tragic. His relationship with it changed immediately when he was fired. But then it kind of reverted back to the exact thing that powered it to begin with. After he was fired and got his job back, he was sort of aware of the cycle of pain that could exist for him, but he doesn't know anything other than that. And so he chooses the fantasy of being in charge as the thing that will, a fantasy of imprisonment in a way.
And I think you just tipped your hand to a little late breaking news. When the show left off, George had become the general manager of the Renaissance Festival. So you were telling me something new has just happened.
And as of, I guess last Monday, George, after watching episodes 2 and 3, he gave Jeff his old job back. So Jeff is now the new and returning general manager of the Texas Renaissance Festival. For those in the back, I guess it's a spoiler, but Jeff is fired at the end of episode 3, or at the beginning really, and he gets his wife's job. Actually, he becomes the entertainment director of the fair at a quarter of his pay. And so now looking back at it, I'm kind of like Jeff. Maybe he's like Kaiser Sose and Usual Suspects. It's like, maybe he saw this whole thing from the moment I met him. Maybe he realized that, this would happen, that, he knew the cycle of general managers being fired and let go all the time. And I think he kind of knew maybe that this would happen to him. And so he thought successfully that if he was in a documentary about the experience, like the psychological costs of working there, and still his performance is that he loves the place so much, that George would see it and that George would, recognize how loyal he is. So it's positive, but dark.
There once again, your process of making this documentary has changed the outcome.
Yeah, it's crazy. A friend of mine was sort of like, he was joking. He's like, it's like the thin blue line, man. And I was just like, the guy got out of death row. I think that's a little different here.
Many thanks to Lance and Paul for joining us on the podcast today, and also to our friends at Film at Lincoln Center and, of course, HBO for helping us put this conversation together. Be sure to check out Ren Faire. All 3 episodes are streaming right now on Max. We will have links, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube and our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And please be sure to join us again in a couple of weeks when we post something very special for our 200th episode. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us, and long live the king.